Picture this: a quiet suburban home in Atascocita, Texas. A mother of 6 sits with federal agents at her kitchen table, finally gathering the courage to tell them the truth. She's holding her baby in her arms, her toddler nearby, her heart racing as she speaks. She believes help has finally arrived. But before her story can even be written down, the front door bursts open. The man in uniform, the man she's accusing, storms in with a gun. What happens next will leave her children orphaned, her community shaken, and a nation asking how this could have happened. This is the story of Takara Jen Hightower, a woman who tried to survive, but whose cries for help ended in silence. Welcome to Silent Crimes HQ. And before we begin, ask yourself this: if federal agents couldn't save her inside her own home, who would save you if you were alone? That thought should make you pause, and it should make you subscribe right now. Because if you don't, these stories vanish just like the voices of the victims themselves. Before her life was reduced to headlines and crime reports, Takara Jen Hightower was a woman defined by love, resilience, and the quiet chaos of raising 6 children. To those who knew her best, she wasn't just a statistic in a tragic case. She was the steady heartbeat of a family. Born in Illinois, Takara grew up in a family where faith and hard work were constant. Friends recall her laughter, a sound that could brighten even the darkest of rooms, and her determination to provide the very best for her children. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't famous, but in her children's eyes, she was everything. Life for Takara had never been simple. With 6 children to raise, her days were full. School drop-offs, late-night feedings, homework battles, and stolen moments of joy. Neighbors described her as protective, always keeping her kids close. The kind of mother who sacrificed sleep, rest, and comfort just to make sure her children had what they needed. But behind the warm smile and the daily routines, there were shadows. Friends noticed moments when her eyes lingered too long on the floor, as though she carried a weight she couldn't fully share. There were whispers of arguments, signs of struggle, hints of fear that she tried so hard to hide. Like so many women in her situation, she carried the burden alone, hoping each day would be better than the one before. Her love for her children, though, never faltered. To them, she was more than a caretaker. She was their protector, their guide, their anchor in a world that often felt uncertain. Even in moments of quiet suffering, she managed to pack lunches with little notes of encouragement, show up at school events, and wrap her arms around them at the end of long days. She was fighting battles no one else could see, yet she was determined to shield her kids from the storm brewing inside their home. As her children grew, so did her sense of urgency. She wanted them to have a life untainted by fear, to know safety in a way she hadn't always known herself. She was not just surviving, she was trying to break a cycle, to give her children the gift of a future that looked different from her present. To the outside world, Takara was another mother doing her best in suburban Texas. But to those who listened closely, her story was already a cry for help. A cry that would soon collide with a system too slow, too hesitant, and too unprepared to save her. And it was in these quiet, hidden moments of her life that the tragedy of what was to come began to take shape. Takara wasn't just a victim in waiting. She was a woman who fought every day to live, to protect, and to endure. But the man she once trusted, the father of her children, was becoming a force she could no longer shield them from. This is where her story truly begins. Not with her death, but with her life, her love, and the silent courage of a woman determined to be more than just another forgotten name. On the surface, Gregory L. Hightower was the kind of man people were taught to respect. A senior chief petty officer in the United States Navy, he wore his uniform with polished pride, the medals on his chest gleaming as symbols of a career built on discipline and loyalty. In the community, he was more than just a sailor. He was a recruiter, a man entrusted with shaping the future of the Navy by guiding young men and women into service. Neighbors and colleagues saw a man of authority, someone who carried himself with a presence that demanded recognition. He was known for his confidence, his ability to command a room, and his talent for persuasion. Recruiters are trained to inspire trust, to convince others to follow a path of honor and sacrifice. And Gregory wore that role well. But behind the walls of his home, another story was unfolding. The same voice that could charm potential recruits could also thunder with rage. The same hands that shook the hands of new sailors could clench into fists. To the outside world, he was a decorated serviceman. To Takara, he was a man who could turn from calm to explosive in an instant. Their marriage had been built on love once, or at least the promise of it. But over the years, that promise became clouded by suspicion, by arguments that grew louder and more violent. Takara, like so many spouses of those in uniform, found herself trapped between the image her husband projected to the world and the reality she lived behind closed doors. In July of 2022, the cracks in their home could no longer be hidden. Takara reached out to local law enforcement, alleging that Gregory had abused her. He in turn made counterclaims. Yet when the reports reached prosecutors, nothing moved forward. No charges. No protections. On paper it was a dispute, he said, she said. In reality, it was the sound of a warning siren, one that would go unanswered. Gregory's position in the Navy gave him a shield of authority, one that Takara's words struggled to pierce. He was respected, uniformed, and trained in systems that often closed ranks around their own. For Takara, speaking out wasn't just about risking her safety. It was about challenging the image of a man the world admired. Friends later recalled that Takara seemed exhausted, worn down by the struggle of trying to be believed. Yet even as fear tightened around her, she stayed. Part of it was survival. Where could a mother of 6 go? What choices did she have? And part of it was the hope, however faint, that things might change. But Gregory was changing too. His temper sharpened. His control grew stronger. And though Takara tried to shield her children, the storm within their household was gaining strength. In the community, he was still Senior Chief Hightower, the recruiter in a crisp uniform. But in the home, he was a presence that filled every corner with tension. The uniform that represented honor for the nation had, for Takara, become a mask hiding the face of her greatest fear. The Navy had given Gregory status, authority, and a weapon. For Takara, all of that meant danger. And as her world closed in, she began looking for someone, anyone, who would finally listen. The summer of 2022 turned heavy for Takara. The complaint she filed in July hadn't brought her the protection she needed. Her words were written down, the reports submitted, but no action came. On paper, she was just another woman in a domestic dispute. But inside her home, she knew what that silence really meant. Danger was circling closer. By September, Takara's fear had sharpened into urgency. Just 2 days before her death, she reached out again. This time asking about a restraining order, a piece of paper she hoped would create a line between her and Gregory. But that line never came. Bureaucracy moved slowly, and time was something Takara didn't have. She carried on as best she could, still taking care of her children, still showing up in the small ways that only mothers can. A smile at breakfast, a gentle word before school, a hug that felt like a promise. But behind those everyday moments, her mind was racing. She knew he was growing restless. She knew the walls were closing in. Gregory's presence in the house had become unbearable. He was angry watching her, controlling. Takara, every sound could be a warning. The slam of a door, the sharpness in his voice, even his silence. It all carried the threat of what might come next. For her children's sake, she tried to hold the family together. For her own sake, she began to whisper for help more urgently than ever before. This was the storm before the collapse. She was fighting to protect her children, to find some way out, yet the very institutions meant to guard her seemed blind. She was speaking, but her voice was echoing in an empty room. By mid-September, her story had caught the attention of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS. They had been told about her allegations against Gregory, the decorated recruiter, the senior chief in uniform. For the first time, Takara might have felt a flicker of hope. The Navy, his own system, was looking into him. Perhaps this time someone would listen. But hope can be cruel. Because while she was preparing to finally tell her truth, the man she feared was watching, waiting, and planning. The tension in her home was no longer hidden. It was a storm cloud ready to break. And when it did, it would strike with a violence so sudden, so absolute, that it would leave 6 children without a mother and a community shaken to its core. The storm was almost here. The date was set. The place was her own home. And the moment would come not when she was alone, but when she was finally trying to be heard. September 22, 2022. The afternoon sun filtered quietly over the suburban streets of Atascocita, Texas. For neighbors, it was just another Thursday. Children played, cars passed by, doors opened and closed without a thought. But inside one home, history was about to be written in gunfire. At around 1:30 p.m., 2 NCIS agents sat with Takara in her living room. Papers spread across the table, pens ready, their voices calm and professional. Takara held her baby in her arms as she spoke. Her toddler played nearby. It was supposed to be a conversation that might change her life. A chance to finally tell her story to people who had the power to act. Imagine her relief at that moment. For the first time, she wasn't whispering to a friend, or filing a report that no one would answer. She was speaking to federal investigators. She was brave, she was tired, and she was determined. This was supposed to be the beginning of her safety. Then it happened. The sound of the door crashing open shattered the fragile peace. Gregory Hightower, her husband, the man in uniform, stood there with a gun. His rage filled the air like a storm breaking open. The room, once filled with words, became filled with terror. Takara had no time to plead, no time to move. She was still holding her baby when Gregory raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. In an instant, the life of a 34-year-old mother of 6 was stolen. She collapsed, her child still in her arms, the sound of gunfire echoing through the walls of the home she had tried to make safe. The NCIS agents reacted immediately. Shots rang out as they tried to defend themselves and the children. In the chaos, one of the agents was struck, collapsing to the ground, wounded but alive. The baby and toddler were pulled away, spared from the bullets that tore their world apart. Gregory fled the scene, leaving behind a blood-stained living room and a silence so heavy it would never be forgotten. Outside, neighbors heard the shots, unaware that just steps away, a family's life had been destroyed in seconds. For Takara's children, time split into 2 that day. Before the shots and after. Before, their mother was the center of their world. After, she was gone, taken in front of witnesses, in front of agents sworn to protect. The house on Tulloch Lane would never be the same again. What began as a safe meeting with investigators ended as the very stage for her execution. And as the news spread, the horror only deepened. Because this wasn't just another case of violence hidden behind closed doors. This was a killing carried out in the presence of those meant to stop it. A killing that showed, in the most brutal way, just how quickly safety can collapse. The gunfire inside that suburban home was only the beginning. Gregory Hightower, Navy senior chief and fugitive husband, ran from the scene he had just turned into a grave. His wife lay dead, his infant and toddler left motherless, an NCIS agent bleeding on the floor. He fled into the streets of Harris County, a man in uniform now branded as a murderer. Law enforcement moved fast. Within minutes, words spread across radio channels. A military recruiter had killed his wife during a federal interview and was on the run. Patrol cars roared through the highways, helicopters scanned from above, neighborhoods went on high alert. 4 hours, Gregory disappeared into the sprawl of northwest Harris County. But he couldn't outrun the net closing in. Deputies tracked his movements, each report narrowing the circle. The man who once hunted recruits for the Navy was now the hunted. By evening they found him. The confrontation erupted in gunfire, a standoff that shattered the silence of another neighborhood. Deputies exchanged shots with the man who had already destroyed so many lives that day. The uniform he had once worn as a symbol of authority and pride was now only a reminder of betrayal. The shootout was fierce but brief. When the dust settled, Gregory Hightower was dead. The same hands that had sworn an oath to serve his country had ended his wife's life, left his children orphans, and then fallen to law enforcement's bullets. In less than 24 hours, the Hightower family lost both parents. One murdered, the other killed in a blaze of violence. The news spread quickly across Houston and beyond. A Navy senior chief, a decorated recruiter, died after killing his wife in front of federal agents. The chase was over. But the destruction he left behind was only beginning to be felt. 6 children suddenly orphaned. A grandmother forced to step in. And a community left with questions no one could yet answer. When the gunfire stopped and the chase ended, 6 children were left in a silence no child should ever know. The youngest, still a baby, had been in Takara's arms when the shots rang out. Too young to understand, but old enough to carry the invisible scar of what happened that day. A toddler, wide-eyed and trembling, had seen the chaos unfold. For them, the memory of their mother's last moments would forever linger in fragments. Flashes of sound, fear, and confusion. Then there were the older children, already old enough to understand. News travels fast, and for them the world came crashing down in words no child should ever hear. Your mother is gone. Your father is dead. Takara's children were torn apart in an instant, not just from their parents, but from the safety of everything they had known. One moment their mother was the anchor of their home. The next they were orphans, forced to stand in a world that had taken both parents in a single day of blood and betrayal. Their grandmother, Chinetha Glenn, rushed from Illinois to Texas, leaving her own life behind to become their guardian. 6 children spanning from infancy to college age, suddenly depending on her strength. The responsibility was immense, the grief overwhelming. Yet she stepped forward because she knew she had no choice. In the quiet after the storm, the children's laughter was replaced by tears, their routines by chaos, their future by uncertainty. No bedtime story, no warm hug, no familiar voice calling them to dinner. Just an absence that grew heavier with each passing day. And for the older ones, the hardest truth of all. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't fate. It was their father who pulled the trigger. The man who should have been their protector had become the reason they would grow up without a mother. For the 6 children, September 22, 2022, would never be just another date. It was the day the world shifted, the day innocence was stolen, the day their family was shattered beyond repair. The chase was over. The violence had ended. But the true victims, those 6 children, were only just beginning to live with the shadow of what happened in that house on Tulloch Lane. Every tragedy leaves questions, but in Takara's case the questions became indictments. Because this was not a death that came without warning. The The signs were there, the reports were made, the cries for help were spoken aloud. Yet the system, the very structure meant to protect her, let her slip through its cracks. Back in July 2022, Takara had already reached out to Harris County deputies, reporting abuse at the hands of her husband. Gregory countered with his own claims, and prosecutors declined to file charges. On paper, the matter was closed. In reality, the danger only deepened. Then, in September 2022, just 2 days before her murder, she asked about filing a restraining order. She was searching for that thin line of legal protection, a document that could have forced distance, a barrier between herself and the man she feared. But bureaucracy moved slowly. The request remained unfinished, and 2 days later she was gone. Even on the day of her death, as NCIS agents sat with her in her living room, the system was in motion, but far too late. She was killed in the very act of making her complaint. The investigators were there, the process had begun, and still it wasn't enough to save her. After her death, outrage spread. How could a mother of 6, sitting with federal agents, be killed in her own home? How could the signs of violence reported months before be ignored? How could the Navy, with all its authority, allow one of its own to remain armed, unchecked, even as allegations of abuse were investigated? Her mother, Chinitha Glenn, demanded answers. She filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Navy, arguing that the institution failed her daughter. The claim was clear. They knew Gregory was under investigation, they knew he was dangerous, and yet they did not disarm him, did not protect Takara, did not act when action was most needed. To many, it was more than a personal failure. It was a systemic one. The Navy was trusted to police its own. Local authorities were expected to intervene. Prosecutors were supposed to protect the vulnerable. And yet Takara died holding her child, her final moments stolen by a system too slow to move. Her death revealed a truth no one wanted to face. Sometimes, even when every warning is given, even when every plea is spoken, the institutions designed to protect can become as silent as the crimes themselves. In the weeks after the gunfire faded, the ripples of Takara's death spread far beyond her home in Atascocita. The house on Tulloch Lane stood silent, its walls scarred by violence, its rooms haunted by absence. But the true weight of her loss was carried in the arms of her mother, who now faced the impossible task of raising 6 children who would never again hear their mother's voice. The community rallied as communities do when tragedy strikes. Vigils were held. Candles flickered in the night. Strangers donated to GoFundMe pages, hoping that money could ease a wound that would never fully heal. Friends spoke her name with grief, refusing to let her story vanish into another forgotten headline. But for those closest to her, every day was a reminder. The children grew up carrying a burden they never asked for, the knowledge that their mother's courage was met with silence, and her bravery cost her life. Their grandmother, strong as she was, bore the responsibility of holding together a family shattered in an instant. And yet, Takara's story did not end there. Her name became part of a larger fight. A lawsuit carried her voice into courtrooms, demanding that the Navy answer for the choices that left her unprotected. Advocates pointed to her case as proof of what happens when domestic violence is dismissed, delayed, or ignored. Her legacy is not just in the pain she endured, but in the truth her death revealed. A truth that still chills anyone who hears it. Takara was killed while speaking to federal agents in her own home. She did everything the system told her to do. She reported, she asked for help, she cooperated. And still she died. For Silent Crimes HQ, this is where we leave her story. But for her children, her mother, and those who loved her, it never ends. Each day they live with the silence she left behind. And now the question falls to you. How many more stories like Takara's are buried in silence? How many more names will fade away if no one speaks them out loud? Don't let her story die a second time. Subscribe to Silent Crimes HQ, because every victim deserves a voice, and silence is where the crimes win.